When the war finally ended in 1945, America was a nation of builders again. Men came home with calloused hands and restless energy, ready to trade rifles for blueprints. The sound of hammers replaced gunfire, and for the first time in years, people began to imagine tomorrow again. Among them was a young immigrant named Joseph Gerber, who arrived in the United States with little more than his mother's sewing kit and a head full of impossible ideas. He was 19, thin as a pencil, and already certain that the world could be drawn better, not just dreamed better. He had fled the shadows of Europe with his mother before the darkness consumed everything. The journey to America had been filled with more silence than words, both of them clinging to the promise of a land where creation, not destruction, defined a man's worth. They settled in Connecticut, in a modest apartment that smelled of starch and fabric, because his mother worked as a seamstress to pay the rent. At night, Joseph studied. Lines, graphs, formulas, he devoured them all. Mathematics felt like the opposite of war. It built instead of broke. But even numbers could be slow, heavy, stubborn things, and Joseph, impatient by nature, longed to find a way to make thinking faster. One evening, while watching his mother measure and cut fabric under a dim lamp, he noticed the rhythm in her movements, the way she stretched the tape across the cloth, the quick adjustments, the precise flick of her scissors. It was almost musical. And that night something clicked. He thought, what if ideas could move like that? In 1945, while studying at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, he began experimenting with a device that could make calculations visual, something that would let engineers design with motion, not static numbers. Using spare parts, string, and bits of drafting film, he built a strange contraption that combined a slide rule with a mechanical arm. When he moved one part, others followed in perfect proportion. He called it the Gerber variable scale. It wasn't too pretty, a tangle of gears and transparent plastic, but when Joseph demonstrated it, even skeptical professors leaned closer. The device could draw accurate curves and proportional diagrams in seconds. What once took hours of manual calculation now took moments. But for Joseph, it wasn't about saving time. It was about saving possibility. He wanted to give engineers and dreamers a tool that let them keep their imagination flowing, uninterrupted by the friction of math. When he graduated, he didn't take a job at a factory or a drafting table. He rented a small space above a laundromat in Hartford, set up a workbench, and began producing the device himself. He had assembled the first 100 units, packed them in brown boxes, and mailed them to universities and design firms across America. By 1948, the Gerber variable scale was quietly revolutionizing engineering labs, and in its humblest way, it was part of the same post-war wave that brought televisions into homes and highways across the land. America was modernizing, and Joseph Gerber, the boy who had once fled destruction, was now helping to draw a new kind of peace, the peace of progress. But Joseph didn't stop there, because as he stared at the blueprints and plastic arms on his table late one night, he realized something profound. The tool he had built for precision might hold the secret to automation. And automation, in 1949, sounded like science fiction. By 1950, Hartford was humming with the rhythm of reinvention. The war's dust had settled, and America's factories were no longer building tanks or planes. They were building tomorrow. Radios, refrigerators, televisions, everything that once seemed like magic was becoming part of everyday life. And in a narrow upstairs workshop above a laundromat on Main Street, Joseph Gerber sat surrounded by mechanical parts, translucent film, and more dreams than money. The hum of the machines downstairs blended with the scratch of his pencil as he sketched what he called machines that think for the hands. He believed that design, the act of creation itself, shouldn't be limited by human fatigue. Engineers spent endless nights redrawing the same lines, repeating calculations that stole time from imagination. Joseph wanted to free them, to build something that could think ahead, just enough to let humans stay inspired. His little company, Gerber Scientific Instruments, was nothing more than a few rented rooms and a couple of determined young engineers who believed in his ideas. They worked long hours testing levers and pulleys, drawing perfect circles, redrawing them, and cursing quietly when the ink smeared. But even in frustration, there was something electric in that room, the kind of quiet fire that can only come from people who feel they standing at the edge of something new. In those early days, Gerber couldn't afford advertising. Instead, he traveled by train across the country, suitcase in hand, demonstrating his device to anyone who would listen. University professors, factory foremen, even government officials, all of them watched this small, wiry man as he pulled out his invention and traced a perfect arc across the page with nothing more than a flick of his wrist. "What is it, exactly?" they'd ask. "It's the way to make the future visible," he'd reply with a shy smile. He spoke with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't just built a tool, but unlocked a new way of thinking. Every sale, every small contract helped him stay afloat, but it was the letters that kept him going. Letters from engineers saying his device saved them hours, from teachers who said their students finally understood geometry, from designers who said they felt creative again. Still, there were nights when Gerber wondered if he was fooling himself. Competition was rising. The world was moving fast, faster than one small inventor could keep up. But he refused to give up. One summer evening, while testing a new prototype for a drafting machine, the belt on his mechanism snapped. He stared at the broken part and almost instinctively began to sketch a new system, one that used light instead of tension, precision instead of guesswork. And that's when the idea came, what if machines could draw using light itself? In that moment, a simple drafting accident became the spark for the next chapter of industrial history. Gerber envisioned machines guided by optics and computation, where patterns could be projected, scaled, and traced with absolute precision. To the few people who listened, it sounded impossible, but they said the same thing about flight. By 1952, his new invention, a photoplotter that could reproduce designs on film using light, caught the attention of a defense contractor. They wanted to use it for printed circuit boards, a new kind of technology that promised faster communication and smarter machines. Suddenly, Joseph's quiet workshop wasn't so quiet anymore. Trucks arrived with materials, orders piled up. The air smelled of warm metal and fresh coffee. His small team grew into dozens of workers, most of them immigrants like him, chasing the same post-war dream of building a better life through work that mattered. And for the first time, Joseph allowed himself a moment to breathe. Standing by the open window one night, he looked out at the glowing city and thought of his mother, the seamstress who once cut fabric by hand. He realized that all his inventions were, in some way, an echo of her work, her precision, her patience, her rhythm. She had measured cloth, he measured possibility. But not everyone saw it that way. As Gerber's technology began to replace human draftsmen, whispers started spreading. He's building machines to replace people. He's making art mechanical. He's stealing jobs from honest workers. The same hands that once applauded his genius now trembled with fear at what it meant. Joseph had wanted to liberate people from repetition, not erase them. But progress rarely asks permission, and soon his invention was transforming industries faster than he could control. And yet, deep down, he knew what was happening couldn't be undone. The future had already started drawing itself. By the mid-1950s, the air inside Gerber's scientific instruments was thick with change, the kind that hummed like electricity in the walls. Engineers worked past midnight, their white shirts rolled to the elbows, the glow of lamps bending over drafting tables that no longer held pencils but wires and light lenses. Joseph Gerber stood among them, part inventor, part conductor, guiding his small orchestra of minds. They weren't building weapons or airplanes like so many had during the war. They were building precision, the quiet kind that could shape everything else. His photoplotter, the strange new machine that used light to draw instead of ink, was unlike anything the industrial world had ever seen. Where a human hand could waver, this machine stayed true. It could map entire circuit boards onto film with microscopic perfection. Suddenly, blueprints for electronics, aviation systems, and communications equipment could be made faster and cleaner than ever before. Word spread quickly. The New York Times ran a small feature calling him the man who teaches light to draw. Factories across the country wanted one. The government called. The Navy called. Even automobile designers began asking if his system could make their lines smoother, their parts fit tighter. And yet, while orders poured in, Joseph felt something uneasy beneath the surface, a tension between man and machine that no one seemed ready to face. In 1955, he attended an industry conference in Chicago. Rows of men in gray suits filled the convention hall, the smell of ink and ambition thick in the air. Gerber stepped on stage, holding a roll of transparent film in one hand. He showed them what light could do, how it could map a pattern in seconds, how it could automate accuracy itself. When he finished, the audience applauded, but not everyone smiled. One older draftsman, a man whose steady hands had designed bridges and engines for 20 years, stood and said, "That's clever, son, but if the machines draw the plans, what's left for the men?" The question landed like a stone. Gerber hesitated, then answered softly, "To imagine what the machines can't." The man didn't respond. He just sat down, and the applause felt thinner now. That night, back in his hotel room, Joseph couldn't sleep. He stared at the city lights and thought about his own hands, how they used to tremble when he built his first device, how they still ached from the long hours. Could machines ever feel that ache, the weight of building something that matters? He didn't think so. But he also knew this: progress doesn't wait for comfort. The world that had once relied on brute force now demanded precision, and precision had a new name: automation. By 1957, Gerber's inventions had reached industries he'd never imagined. Garment factories used his systems to cut fabric with mathematical accuracy. Aerospace companies traced wings using light instead of rulers. Even NASA began looking at his designs. The boy who had once watched his mother measure dresses by hand now supplied the technology shaping the future of flight. But amid success, Joseph began to notice what was missing: the laughter, the clatter of voices, the shared rhythm of craftsmen at work. Now there was only the hum of machines, the click of relays, the whisper of motors doing what humans once did with pride. One evening, a young engineer approached him after work. "Mr. Gerber," he said quietly, "don't you ever miss the sound of pencils on paper?" Joseph smiled sadly. "Every day," he said. "But if we've done our job right, those pencils aren't gone. They've just moved into the hands of the dreamers who come next." He believed that, even if part of him wasn't sure anymore. The same week, his mother visited the factory. She walked between the machines, her eyes shining with wonder and confusion. When she reached him, she placed her hand on his arm and said, "You've built something beautiful, Joseph. But promise me you won't forget that beauty starts with hands, not wires." He nodded, though he didn't know how to promise that. And as he stood beside her, surrounded by the quiet pulse of invention, Joseph Gerber realized that progress, like light, could illuminate or blind, depending on how you used it. The challenge wasn't just to build machines that could think. It was to make sure humanity kept thinking, too. By the early 1960s, the world Joseph Gerber had imagined was no longer an idea. It was real, and it was humming. His machines lived in factories across the United States and Europe, whispering through metal and glass, translating human vision into mechanical precision. The Gerber photoplotter became an industry standard, the invisible tool behind the television screens, circuit boards, and satellites that would define a new era. But for Joseph, the greatest satisfaction wasn't fame or wealth. It was walking through a factory and seeing the glow of light moving across the machines he dreamed up years earlier in that small room above the laundromat. The same motion he once saw in his mother's scissors now lived in beams of focused light, tracing the language of innovation. And yet, even amid all the progress, he couldn't escape a growing ache, the kind that comes when success starts to feel quieter than it should. He noticed it in the way the older engineers spoke less at meetings, how their faces grew still when a new automated process replaced another team. The energy of invention had turned into efficiency, and efficiency, he realized, had no heartbeat. One evening in 1963, Gerber returned to his workshop long after everyone had gone home. The building was dark except for the steady pulse of a single photoplotter at the far end of the room, its narrow beam of light drawing a perfect grid across a sheet of film. He stood there watching it, the hum of the motor like a lullaby. He thought about how far they had come, from pencils to photons, from hand-drawn lines to light-speed accuracy. The world had never been more precise. But he couldn't help but ask himself, had it lost something softer along the way? That night he began writing in his notebook, not equations, not measurements, but thoughts. "Machines can calculate, but they cannot imagine," he wrote. "They can repeat, but not dream. The true challenge is not to make the perfect machine, but to remind man what perfection is for." It became something of a personal creed. In the years that followed, Gerber expanded his inventions beyond engineering. He built computerized cutters for clothing factories, plotters for maps, and medical devices that could trace patterns of the human heartbeat with microscopic accuracy. Each new invention carried the same quiet hope that his machines could make people's lives not just easier, but more human. When people asked him why he kept working, when he'd already achieved more than most inventors could dream of, he would smile and say, because every invention should give something back to the hands that built it. By the time he was older and his hair had turned white, the world had caught up with his vision. Computers were no longer fantasy. They were tools of everyday life. His early work had helped shape what engineers called computer-aided design, or CAD, a phrase he never particularly liked, because he didn't see computers as replacing design. To him, they were extensions of thought. In 1980, during a small ceremony honoring his life's work, a reporter asked him what invention he was most proud of. Joseph paused, then replied quietly, "None of them." The room fell silent. "I'm proud," he continued, "that the world now believes ideas can start small, on a kitchen table, in a sewing room, in a laundromat, and still change everything." The audience applauded, but Gerber only smiled faintly. For him, it was never about applause. It was about the rhythm of creation, that delicate thread between imagination and reality, between the hands that measure and the light that remembers. When he passed years later, his machines were still running, still tracing blueprints, cutting patterns and drawing dreams. And somewhere in a quiet factory, a beam of light still swept gently across a sheet of film, remembering the man who once taught it how to move. Because even though technology changes, the spark that starts it never does. It lives in those who believe that progress, at its best, is not the replacement of humanity, but the reflection of it. And that, perhaps, was Joseph Gerber's greatest invention of all. Before you go, take a moment to think about what this story really means. It wasn't just about machines or invention. It was about the hands behind every idea and the quiet courage it takes to keep building when no one believes in you. Joseph Gerber's story reminds us that progress isn't about replacing people. It's about remembering that every great innovation starts with a single human spark, a thought, a sketch, a dream scribbled in the margins of an ordinary day. Maybe you built something small that no one noticed. Maybe your ideas live in notebooks or garage corners, waiting for the right moment. Don't let them fade. The world still runs on the hearts and minds of those who dare to create, even in silence. If stories like this move you, if they remind you of the beauty, the struggle, and the spirit that built the world we live in, then make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet miracles. Because every story we tell here is a tribute to people like Joseph, and maybe, just maybe, people like you.